makers. I'm Katherine with Minerva, and today we are going to do a sew along for the Deer and Doe Bleuet dress. Let's get to it. Now before we can begin, we need to gather up all of our materials. We actually have a kit available for the Bleuet dress, and you can find any of our kits using the hashtag Minerva exclusive kits. Now, in this kit, you will get a printed paper pattern for your dress, as well as enough yardage of fabric, and there are a couple of different colorways to choose from. I decided to go with this beautiful navy and royal blue combination with the white. And then you are also going to get some matching thread that goes with your fabric, as well as some interfacing. The buttons, of course, are included, and you will also get some bias binding tape to finish off the armhole edges. Now, once you have all of that prepared and gathered, I like to pre-wash my fabric in the manner in which I am going to wash my dress. That being said, I put mine in the machine as well as the dryer just to pre-shrink anything. Then you're going to go ahead and select what size you're going to make and choose which option. So there are two views for this dress. We have view A, which is just a very simple shirt dress. It has a clean back as well as a sleeveless option here. And then view B has the optional cap sleeves, which I decided to make, as well as a fun bow detail in the back. Today, I'm going to be going through view B for you. Let's get started. Okay, so let's get into it by prepping our pattern to get stitching. So with this, we've got the paper pattern. You can trace it out or cut it out like I did in this case here. So just follow the proper grain lines. I'm using my quilting ruler to double check the grain lines here, just to make sure everything lines up. And then I like to use a rotary cutter and mat to cut out my patterns. I find it gives the most precise results. But however you cut them out, be sure to also clip in those notches. I like to clip in with this fabric. Number 2, sew the optional back bow. So this is option B, and it has this really cute back bow. So we are going to place both pieces right sides together and just stitch the top and the bottom here. So I am just stitching, and be sure to back stitch on both ends and do the exact same thing on the other side here, leaving both of those short curved ends open so that we can flip it. So I'm going to press it to lock those stitches, and then I'm going to turn it right side out. Now in this instance, we want to make sure that we are rolling that seam so it is exactly along that edge. And once that is done, I like to top stitch this in place just for a nice finished look. The rest of the dress has some nice top stitching, so I want to include that. And this is the bow wrap. So if it's 2.5 inches when folded, we don't want that. We want it to be that 2 inches when folded right sides together. Once we have that, we are going to fold it back out, give it a nice good press, and then I top stitched either side, and we are going to wrap it around the bow. So in order to create that wrap, we are just going to stitch across here. I serged it because it gives a nice finished edge. And then I'm going to press that with that seam in the center back. Now I am going to pleat up this bow and place it through that ring. And we've got this bow that we can attach to the back of the dress. So right here, you can see we have our notches on the back, and we're going to match it with the notches on the bow. And so I'm just pinning that in place, and this is along the back princess seam. So this is our center back. And then you can see that is where our seam allowance is. So we want to tack it on within that seam allowance. So number 3, sewing the back princess seam. So next we are going to place right sides together and match up those notches once again over top of that bow, sandwiching that bow in between, and then pinning it up. So you'll notice that this is a princess seam in the back, so it is not going all the way up to the top of the seam here. We're going to stitch all the way down on both sides. I decided to serge the edges to finish it. You can zigzag or do whatever seam finishing you like, and then press those seams towards that side back piece. And then we're going to do some top stitching. So go ahead and stitch that. And I am stitching fairly close, about 1/4 of an inch from the edge of that seam, just so I can catch in that serged edge on the other end for that top stitching. It just holds everything nice and flat and is really important with that bow. Number 4, prepping the button placket. So grab your interfacing from the kit here. And then we are going to fold it in half, and then we are going to cut some strips. I'm just truing up this edge so it is nice and straight, and I am cutting strips about 1 inch long, and I have cut 2 full width of fabric lengths of those. And then I'm going to measure 1.5 inches from the raw edge, going all the way down, and then along that edge, over top of where we're going to do the buttonholes and stitch on the buttons, I am going to place our interfacing. Now you want to use a pressing cloth or it will likely melt, and don't rub it back and forth. Lift your iron up and down, and this will prevent any wrinkles within that interfacing. Number 5, sew the center front. So with this, we have our center front to our side front pieces here, and we're just going to match them up, matching those notches. Now it's really important to match up the notches so that everything lines up exactly. And coming into this deeply curved princess seam, you're going to want to put a few more pins in here just to avoid any puckering or slipping. And then stitch both of those sides and serge them or finish them. And then we are going to press these towards the side front of the bodice. And with this deep curve here, I am just using my pressing ham on this. Now you may want to clip that curve just to help it lie a little bit flat. I didn't need to though. Number 6, sew the front to the back at the side seams. So now we are going to stitch the front to the back here. And so we're just going to place those pieces together, and once again, matching up those notches along the side. Now these should match exactly from the underarm seam all the way down to the hem. If they don't, maybe you've attached things slightly differently. So just go ahead and pin both sides in place, as well as pinning the shoulder seams. We can stitch them all at the same time. So both the side seams as well as those 2 shoulder seams. And so I went ahead and stitched them as well as overlocked them. And your dress is really coming together. Number 7, we're going to sew the hem facing. So I love this pattern for the fact that it has a hem facing rather than a hem. We are going to take these pieces, we're going to place them right sides together, and along these short edges, we are just going to stitch along here. So I have stitched them. Do not overlock them because we want to open them up and press them flat. It's very important that they lay nice and flat. So I serged the top edge of the hem facing so that we've got a nice finished area here. And then we're going to match up those seams. So match up where the back and the side seams are going. So the front princess seam doesn't have a seam, but it has a notch. And we are going to place it 1.5 inches away from the raw edge. So remember that 1.5 inches that we drew to put on the interfacing for the placket? Well, that's where this also comes into play because we have that button placket that we're going to be pressing over. So press that seam downwards towards that placket and then understitch it. So you can see I've understitched this here. Understitching is incredibly important because when we roll it, it helps the facing not to show from the right side. Now we're going to press this in place. So it is just like so, going all around the edge here. Next, we are going to attach this with a blind hem foot, and mine is foot number R, and I'm going to use stitch right here, number 36 on my baby lock. Yours might be a little bit different, but that's what it will look like. And so then I am just going to first begin by pinning exactly where I want the hem to be. So I find this step really important in making sure that everything is lying quite nicely. Now the second step for doing the blind hem is we're going to fold it back in on itself. And by having those pins in place, it really does help everything. So I'm going in and I'm placing my final pins in, and then I'm removing those pins on the other side. And when we go, the way that this stitch works is we're going to stitch quite a few along the edge that we've got serged already. And then every 3 stitches or so, or 4 stitches, it is going to pop on at it as a zigzag right onto the other area. And this is what creates that blind hem. So see how it goes straight and then the zigzag, and we've got a little bit of those straight stitches. Now onto that button placket. So we're going to fold this over the 2.5 centimeters or 1.5 inches right up to that line. So I was using my hot pressing ruler, but you could just go to that line you drew. And so I am just going to give it a nice good press on both sides, and then I'm going to fold it over once more. And once we fold that over, it's going to cover those markings that we drew for our buttons and buttonholes. And then just fold over that end bit and then top stitch it in place, just like so on both ends. And you've got that button placket. And it's nicely finished with all exposed edges, all hidden nicely inside. Number 9, sew the cap sleeves. So with this, we are going to place the sleeves wrong sides together. It's not very often that we say that in sewing. And I'm going to give it a nice good press so that it stays nicely. And then we're going to baste those raw edges together. Next, we are going to match them up. So the double notches are always the back of the sleeve. So with right sides together, we're going to match the double notch. And then we are also going to match the single notch in the front and the shoulder seam notch. And then just distribute the rest of it in place. You shouldn't have to have any gathers or puckers in this. And it shouldn't go all the way around because it is a cap sleeve. And then we're just going to stitch that in place. So I went ahead and stitched it, and I did not overlock it because we are going to use bias binding to bind and finish the edges of this sleeve. So I'm just trimming off a little extra of that bulk, and I folded out my double fold bias tape, and then I'm going to pin with the raw edge facing the raw edge. And I folded under the top portion here before I start to bring it around because we want a nice finished edge on the inside. So I'm just going around and pinning it until I get to the end. And when I get to the end, I'm just going to overlap it slightly. We don't have to turn under that edge because it is going to be hidden under that folded edge that we just did. So I'm just going to clip it off and stitch around. And so we're going to stitch right close to that edge along that seam allowance area, just like so. And then I am trimming all that extra fabric away, just to remove any bulk. Then I am going to grade that back piece down. So not the folded one, but the one that's not folded. I'm just going to grade that down to reduce some of that bulk. And then I am going to fold it down. And so you can see it is folded nicely and it is covering all of those exposed seams. And I am just pinning this in place. And once I'm done pinning that, we can go ahead and we can top stitch that in place. And so once again, this comes back to that top stitching that you are going to see on the outside of the garment, but really makes a nice design detail on this shirt dress. So we are just going to stitch all the way around like so. And this is what our sleeve will look like. Nice and cute with a nice cap sleeve. Number 10, we're going to sew that collar. So with this, we've got two collar pieces, the collar stand and the main collar. Now, ideally, you are going to put the interfacing on a big block of your fabric and then cut out the pattern pieces. I forgot to do that in this case. So I'm actually doing a piece of interfacing and fusing my pattern pieces on a block with that. And then I'm just going to cut them out, but it should be in that opposite order to do it correctly. On that, it still works. None of the pattern pieces warped and it worked out perfectly, but if you're going to do it the right way, that's how I would suggest. So with the right sides together, grab those collar pieces and we are going to pin them. And we're going to pin them along the sides and then that outer larger curve. And then we are going to grade the seams. So next we are going to grade the under collar close to that seam line. And then we are going to clip those corners as well as create notches along that large outer curve. And so with this, when I'm stitching, we are going to take a couple of stitches in the diagonal. So you don't want to pivot right on the corner. If you want a perfect corner that doesn't have that weird kind of point that sticks out, take 2 stitches on the diagonal. It's going to change your life. So next I'm going to poke out those corners so they sit quite nicely. And then I am going to press this in place. And the reason we're not understitching this collar is because we are going to do some top stitching along here. And so with that, we're going to top stitch all around the edge. Next, we are going to do the collar stand. So right here, I am just matching up the seam allowance, which I know to be for that collar stand, and where we're going to attach it. So we want to make sure that when we sandwich these pieces within, we are matching up the notches on here, and we are sandwiching them right sides together with the collar in between those collar stands. So I'm just going in and I'm doing this inner curve, which is our neckline curve first, and then I'm pinning the sides, but we're only going to stitch up into those notches that we just marked, which happen to be that seam allowance. So leave that 5/8 of an inch on the other end, and then we are going to grade those seam allowances again. Notch in right at that notch. We want the full seam allowance on the main seam allowance on that bottom part that isn't stitched. And then go ahead and notch that inner curve as well, just to help it lie nice and flat. And on any of the exterior curves, you can create little notches to get rid of that excess fabric so it lies nice and flat. Poke out those corners, and then we are going to give it a nice good press so that everything lies nicely in here. And then on this end, we are going to understitch. So make sure the seams are going towards the underside of the collar stand, and go ahead and stitch that in place, and then go and press it. And it should be all looking like this and ready to be attached to our dress. So then we're going to grab the dress and we're going to attach it to the collar piece. So when you're attaching the collar piece, we're only going to attach the one portion of the collar stand, and we are going to fold under that seam allowance. So as you can see, I've folded it under, and then I'm going to do both sides and then match up those notches. We've got notches that line up to the princess seams as well as the center back. So make sure you're lining that up, and then go ahead and stitch that in place along the seam allowance here. So you can see that I'm doing my 5/8 of an inch seam allowance going all the way through. And as you can see along the end, we are coming up and it goes nice and flush. Now, then we have a decent amount of bulk. So what we're going to do, once again, we are going to grade those seam allowances. So we're going to reduce some of that bulk going on here, and we're actually going to grade out the collar stand seam allowance. So we're going to leave the dress fabric as is, and we're going to grade down the collar fabric because that's the interfaced one. That is the one that's a bit more bulky. We're going to press all of the seams up towards that collar stand. So go ahead and press that. Use a pressing ham if you need to. I found this laid nice and flat, and I didn't necessarily need to as much. Next, we are going to fold under the rest of that collar stand, and we are going to finish that edge. So you can see that is looking quite nice. We are going to understitch that in place. So you can see it's understitched. And now we are going to fold under that inside collar piece. So I'm folding in those edges to match, and then we need to fold under that main edge so it goes just a hair below where that seam is. So I like to do this where I finger press it just below the seam and then give it a nice good press. You can add the pins as you go. Just make sure that you are using glass head pins as you go and no steam if you were doing that so your pins don't rust or melt. I like to go in after with my pin. So after I've pressed it, I like to go in from the right side because that's where we're going to be stitching and add my pins in. So I'm going in and I am double checking as I go. So let's flip it to the right side and I'll show you. I'm going to go in and then out, and I check on the other side. Am I catching that fabric? So you see me flipping it over constantly. And the reason for that is just making sure that I've caught that folded seam on that end. Because if I haven't caught it, when you go to stitch it, you're not going to catch it. This is a foolproof method to make sure that you always catch that when you're top stitching that from the right side. It's a little bit more fiddly, takes a bit more time as you're doing it. We are going to stitch in the ditch, not on either side. We want these stitches to be completely invisible. And you can see my pin is exactly within that ditch. And so then it looks beautiful on this side as well as on the other side. Now let's finish that button placket. So grab your buttons and we are going to place them on.
So traditionally, the buttonholes go on the right side and then the buttons go on the left side, but really you are making this. You can put them on whatever side you want. There's a decent amount of bulk along that very first button. I am using my mallet to just pound it. You can use a regular hammer if you don't have a mallet. I would just put some fabric down so you don't wreck it, but it'll help to compress it so that it goes on a little bit nicer. So we are going to do our buttonholes, and I'm using a button chisel to open this up, and go ahead and open up all the buttons. You'll notice all of them are going down except the top button, which goes horizontally. Next, I like to attach my buttons by machine if I can, because it's nice and fast. And so with this, I always like to double check my button placement. Now I've got it marked based on the pattern, but every once in a while you might stitch your buttons just slightly off. So I like to go in with my chalk and a pen and pin and go in and really just mark that center, and then go back in before I stitch it, double checking that placement of the buttons. We have 2 extra buttons from the pack with this kit, and if you ever lose a button, you want to know where you have it and not have to find it in some jar somewhere. I like to attach my extra buttons on the inside of my dress. So I am hand stitching this, and I am only going through that front or that back button placket layer. You're not going to see any of these stitches from the right side, and I'm going to attach both of those extra buttons right along the bottom there. Then I like to use fray stop to hold my buttons in place. I put it on both the front and the back, as well as over the buttonhole. Double check your fabric because sometimes it can stain it. But now for the reveal.
You are all done your shirt dress. We would love to see your makes, so if you don't already have an account, do consider creating one. It is completely free here at Minerva, and you can browse and like other makers and see what they are making as well. If you have any questions at all, do let us know in the comments down below, and we'll get back to you as soon as we're able. And until next time, makers, let's get sewing!